It was a clear night when it happened, nothing but the steady hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of headlights from the rare car that passed in the opposite direction. The road was familiar, a stretch of highway I had driven countless times before, a quiet route through rural backcountry far from the cities with nothing but thick woods lining both sides. The kind of road that was almost too empty at times. I had been on the road for hours, tired from a long day of work, but not quite ready to stop. It was well past midnight, and I was hoping to make it home before the fatigue fully set in. I had the windows cracked just enough to let the night air filter in, the cool breeze a welcome contrast to the stale air inside the car. But then, about an hour into the drive, something felt off. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, just a strange sensation that prickled along my skin. I glanced in my rearview mirror. There was a car behind me, far enough to be a dot in the distance, but close enough that I could see its headlights growing brighter as it approached. Nothing unusual at first, just another driver on an empty highway. Still, I felt an odd unease, a feeling that something wasn't right. I sped up slightly, hoping to shake the car off, but the moment I increased my speed, they did too. The headlights in my mirror grew larger, and I felt my pulse quicken. My heart started pounding in my chest. It wasn't just that they were tailgating, it was the way they were doing it. They didn't seem to be trying to pass me or make any effort to get around. They were just there, hovering. I tried not to panic, thinking maybe they were just speeding, or maybe they just didn't know the road as well as I did. But it was hard to shake the feeling that they were following me deliberately. I glanced at the road ahead, nothing but the dark stretch of asphalt and the endless line of trees. No lights, no signs of civilization. I took a sharp right turn onto a narrower road, hoping to lose them, but the other car followed. It was still behind me, still too close for comfort. I kept going, my foot heavy on the gas, heart racing now, adrenaline taking over. Every time I looked in the mirror, the headlights were just a little too close. Then, suddenly, their lights blinked off. For a moment, everything was silent. I slowed, wondering if they had turned off the road. But as I peered through the rear view, I saw the shadows shift. The car had stopped, but I could make out 3 figures, 3 people now standing in the middle of the road. They weren't moving, just waiting. I felt my stomach drop. I considered turning around, but before I could make a decision, a bright light appeared on the right side of the road. Another car, this time much closer, came barreling toward me. I had no time to think. My instincts kicked in, and I swerved to avoid the oncoming vehicle. That's when they came at me. The first man emerged from the dark trees at the side of the road, a blur of motion, and before I could even react, he lunged. His hand slammed against my driver's side window, hard enough to make me jump. I slammed on the brakes, but it was already too late. The other 2 were there in an instant. One at the front of my car, one at the rear, blocking my way. Panic surge, I grabbed for my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I tried to start the engine again, but the car sputtered. The man at the window was grinning now. His face was pale, almost sickly, with dark circles under his eyes. He had a crowbar in his hand, tapping it against the glass with a rhythmic, almost casual menace. His breath fogged up the window as he leaned in, his face just inches from mine. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice low but commanding. I froze. I knew I shouldn't comply. My brain screamed at me to do something, but my body was frozen. One of the others, tall and broad, started circling around the back of my car. I could hear him grunting as he kicked the tires. My mind raced. I needed to escape. But if I opened the door, if I got out, what would happen? The third man was standing by the front of the car now, holding a weapon. A baseball bat, I think. The moonlight reflected off it as he waved it lazily in the air. The man at my window knocked again, harder this time. I didn't know if I had a chance of making it out alive, but I knew I had to act. I threw the car into reverse without thinking, slamming my foot down on the gas. The tires screeched, the car jerking backward as I narrowly avoided hitting the guy standing by my front bumper. One of them shouted something, but I didn't care. I wasn't sticking around to find out what came next. I sped down the narrow road, my pulse thundering in my ears. As I looked back, I saw the three figures standing in the headlights, still watching, as if they knew I'd come back. But I didn't. I don't know why they were out there, what they wanted, or who they were. But I know I'm lucky I made it out of there that night. I never drive that stretch of road again. Every time I pass it now, I feel a knot tighten in my stomach, as if those three men are still waiting. It was a crisp, moonless night in late fall, the kind of night where the air feels sharp and the roads are eerily empty. I'd just finished a long day at work and was heading home, my usual drive through the winding country roads. The town where I lived was small, tucked away off the main highway, and I often found myself on the road alone at odd hours. This was one of those nights. I was driving my old sedan, the headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkness, the tires humming quietly against the asphalt. The radio played softly in the background, the kind of station that only made the road seem even more deserted. I wasn't in a hurry, but I was tired, and all I wanted was to get home and crash into bed. The highway was desolate, nothing but trees and fields stretching out to either side, with the occasional sign for a gas station or diner miles down the road. There were no street lights, no houses, just me and the blackness. I had been driving for about 45 minutes when I saw him, a man standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. I hadn't passed another car in ages, so I figured he must have been waiting a while. Normally, I wouldn't stop for hitchhikers, too many stories, too many warnings, but for some reason, something about him made me hesitate. He looked ordinary, in his mid-30s, wearing a leather jacket and jeans, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. He didn't look particularly dangerous or suspicious, and for a moment I convinced myself that he was just someone stranded, needing a ride. I slowed down, and before I could second-guess myself, I rolled the window down slightly. "You need a ride?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and desperate. His gaze flickered to the empty road behind me before locking on to mine. There was a brief pause, and then he nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough, like he'd been shouting for help. "I'm just trying to get to the next town. Got a few miles to go. Can you help me out?" I could tell he was cold, shivering even, despite the jacket. Something about the way he spoke felt off, but I still couldn't put my finger on why I should keep driving. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "All right, hop in," I said. "I'm heading that way anyway." He slid into the passenger seat without a word, and I immediately noticed the faint smell of alcohol on him, sour and pungent, but not overpowering. As he buckled his seat belt, I kept my eyes on the road, trying to shake off the creeping unease that was crawling up my spine. For a few minutes, there was silence between us. I tried to make small talk, asked him where he was coming from, what he was doing out here at this hour. He answered in a few clipped words, barely making eye contact, just staring out the window like he was lost in thought. The more I tried to engage, the more distant he seemed, like he was preoccupied with something else. I kept glancing at him. His hands were twitching slightly, and he kept checking the rearview mirror. My skin prickled, but I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late, and I was tired. I needed to stop being so jumpy. But then, just as I passed a curve in the road, the situation took a sudden turn. Without warning, the man reached over and grabbed the door handle, his grip tight, his fingers like iron. I jolted in my seat, my heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. But before I could react, he yanked the door handle, trying to open it. The car swerved slightly as I fought to keep control of the wheel, my blood running cold as I realized what he was trying to do. "I need your wallet," he hissed. "Give me your wallet now." The words hit me like a slap. His voice was calm, but there was a quiet menace behind it now, something I hadn't heard before. I glanced over at him, and the look in his eyes, narrowed, wild, desperate, sent a wave of panic through me. I didn't have time to think. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, my car lurching forward as I sped down the road. "Stop! Stop the car!" he shouted, his voice rising in panic. But I didn't. I wasn't going to give him the chance to get what he wanted. In a split second, he reached over and grabbed my shirt, pulling me toward him. His breath was hot and sour against my ear, his grip tight around my arm, forcing me to swerve again. I could hear the frantic beating of my heart in my ears, but I kept my hands on the wheel, pushing the pedal to the floor. I remember hearing his voice, now pleading, now furious. "You don't know what you're doing. You're going to regret this, man." But I couldn't risk stopping. Not with him so close, not with that look in his eyes. Finally, I saw lights ahead, just a few miles down the road. There was a diner, a place with other cars, maybe people inside. It was my only shot. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, cutting across the lane toward the parking lot. The tires screeched, and I slammed into the curb, sending the car jolting to a stop. I didn't even wait for the car to come to a full stop. I threw the car door open and bolted. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I sprinted toward the diner, my mind racing, my body filled with adrenaline. I didn't look back. I didn't even care to see if he was following. I just kept running until I reached the door, flung it open, and nearly fell inside. The warm light and nose of the diner hit me like a punch in the gut, and the staff inside looked at me, confused but concerned. The man never followed me inside. I don't know if he realized I had gotten away, or if he just didn't want to make a scene. Either way, I didn't stick around to find out. I sat at the counter for a while, breathing heavily, trying to steady myself. The staff offered me coffee, but I couldn't stop shaking long enough to drink it. Eventually, I calmed down enough to leave, but I didn't take the highway back. Instead, I took a longer route, one that was more populated, and drove all the way home with my doors locked and my eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror. The whole incident felt like a blur. I can still see his eyes in my mind, the way they shifted from pleading to violent in the span of moments. I don't know if he had planned on robbing me from the start, or if something had triggered his desperation. But I know one thing for sure: I won't ever stop for another hitchhiker, not after that night. It wasn't just the robbery, it was the way he turned from a harmless stranger into something far more dangerous in the blink of an eye. That's what scared me the most, the sudden shift, and it's a lesson I'll never forget. It was a late winter night when I made the drive back home. The kind of night where the chill in the air seeps into your bones, even with the windows rolled up, and the world outside is wrapped in darkness, like a blanket smothering everything. I was on a long, quiet stretch of road, the kind with no street lights, no gas stations, just miles and miles of trees and the occasional flicker of distant farmhouses. I'm not normally one to get spooked. I've driven late at night more times than I can count, but tonight something felt off. The kind of feeling that gnaws at the back of your neck, like someone's watching you, even though the rearview mirror shows nothing but empty highway behind you. I tried to shake it off, turning the radio dial in search of something to break the silence. That's when I saw the lights in the distance, flashing red and blue. My heart skipped a beat. There were no police stations around here, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. But as I approached, I saw the cruiser on the side of the road, parked at an angle with its lights spinning in the dark, casting an eerie glow over everything. The cop was standing next to it, wearing a dark uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. I slowed, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was a checkpoint, or maybe something had happened on the road ahead. As I neared, the officer raised his hand, signaling me to pull over. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been speeding, I hadn't done anything wrong, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole setup. Even the way the cruiser's headlights didn't quite illuminate the area around it. Everything seemed dimmer than it should be. I pulled to the shoulder and came to a stop. The officer approached my window slowly, his boots making a muffled sound on the gravel. When he reached the window, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His eyes, there was something unnatural about them. They were wide, almost too wide, and glassy. His face was pale, and his expression didn't quite match the situation. He didn't look concerned or even alert, like a cop would. He looked bored, like he was waiting for something. I cracked my window just enough to speak to him. "Officer, is there a problem?" His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Evening, ma'am. You were speeding back there, back near the last mile marker. I'll need to see your license and registration." I had been paying attention to the road, so I knew I wasn't speeding. Still, I nodded and reached for my wallet. "I don't think I was speeding, officer, but..." He cut me off. "License and registration now." There was something in the way he said it that made me hesitate. His tone was too demanding for a casual traffic stop. I wasn't sure why, but every instinct in my body was screaming that this wasn't right. I handed him my documents, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to seem like I was hiding anything. His hand moved slowly as he took them, and I noticed the way his fingers trembled slightly. It wasn't the sort of thing you'd expect from a seasoned officer. Then he just stood there, not speaking, just staring at me. "Is there something wrong, officer?" I asked, my voice unsteady now. My mind was racing, trying to process what felt wrong, but couldn't quite place. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he spoke again, but the words weren't what I expected. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his voice barely a whisper, though I was sure I had heard him clearly. "There are things in the woods, bad things, and they'll get you if you're not careful." I froze. What was he talking about? Who was this guy? He handed my documents back, but his fingers brushed against mine, cold as ice. I looked at the officer, trying to make sense of the situation, but his expression had changed. He was no longer the detached lawman I'd assumed him to be. His face was twisted in a way that was almost hungry. "Drive carefully," he said, before turning and walking back to his cruiser without another word. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to just drive off as fast as I could, but something held me there. My gaze flicked to the side of the road, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels in the dark. I felt as though the shadows themselves were watching me. I had no choice but to roll up my window and start the car again. As I did, I glanced back in the mirror. The officer was still standing there, motionless, watching me. But there was something wrong. His figure, it was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but he didn't look like a cop anymore. He was just a silhouette, a shape, standing far to still in the distance, staring, almost like he was waiting for me to leave. I drove off without another word, my heart pounding as I sped away, but in the rearview mirror, I could see the lights of the cruiser still flashing, though the officer was no longer there. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, my pulse racing. But no matter how much I looked, there was nothing behind me, just the endless stretch of dark, empty road. It wasn't until I got home that I thought to call the local sheriff's office. I wanted to confirm that it had been a legitimate stop, that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. When I described the officer, the dispatcher went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ma'am, there's no record of any units being out on that stretch of highway tonight. We haven't had a single patrol car in that area for hours." I told her about the cruiser, about the officer, about everything, but she just repeated, "We haven't had any officers dispatched to that road tonight." My blood ran cold. I don't know who or what that man was, but he wasn't a cop. Not in the way I thought. Now, every time I drive at night, especially on those long, lonely stretches of road, I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. And every time I see a car with flashing lights in the distance, I hesitate, because I know now some of the things you encounter on dark roads aren't always what they seem, and sometimes it's better to keep driving without stopping.